Michael Langston wasn't expecting anyone to be in his office at midnight, especially not a 6-year-old girl scrubbing the floor like it was her last chance to stay alive. The office building was nearly empty by the time Michael Langston stepped out of the elevator onto the 31st floor. It was late, well past 10, and most of the lights in the hallway had already been dimmed. The hush of the evening wrapped around the sleek, glass corridors like a soft veil, broken only by the low hum of air conditioning and the faint echo of his polished shoes against the marble. He carried his phone in one hand, a tired expression etched into the lines of his face, eyes scanning a long list of emails he had no interest in answering tonight. He pushed open the heavy glass door to his corner office, expecting silence and stillness. But the moment he stepped inside, he stopped. There was someone there. A small shape hunched near the floor by the window, moving slowly back and forth. It took him a second to register what he was seeing. It was a child. A little girl. She couldn't have been older than 6, her tiny frame dressed in a loose blue jumpsuit that hung from her shoulders. On her hands were yellow rubber gloves that looked too big for her fingers. She was on her knees with a sponge in one hand, scrubbing a stubborn mark from the polished tile floor beside the massive glass windows that overlooked the city skyline. A small plastic bucket sat beside her, filled with cloudy water that sloshed with each movement. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, stunned. For a moment, he didn't speak, thinking perhaps he was imagining her, the way fatigue sometimes played tricks on the mind after long hours. But she was real, so real, with chestnut brown hair pulled into a loose braid down her back and soft brown eyes that finally looked up at him when she realized she wasn't alone. He stepped forward slowly, his voice low and incredulous. "What are you doing here?" She blinked once, then looked down again, her hand stilling on the sponge. "I'm cleaning," she said quietly. "You're cleaning?" he repeated, his tone sharper now, a mix of disbelief and rising anger. "Why are you cleaning? You're just a child." The girl didn't flinch. Her small voice was calm, steady in a way that didn't fit her age. "Because I have to. I'm alone. No one else will help." Michael stared at her, unable to speak for a moment. 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind: legal liability, who brought her here, how she got past security, but none of them mattered as much as the image in front of him. A 6-year-old girl, working as a janitor, in his office, alone at night. He crouched down in front of her, his suit tightening at the shoulders, his eyes level with hers. "Who brought you here?" he asked. "My aunt," she said. "She works at night. I help her. She said if I help, she'll let me stay." "Stay where?" "Her apartment. It's small. She says I have to earn it." Michael clenched his jaw. The anger rising in his chest was different from what he was used to in boardrooms and business meetings. This was personal. This was human. He stood up abruptly, pulled out his phone, and dialed his assistant. "Get me security. Now," he said. Then, glancing down at the girl again, he softened. "What's your name?" "Sadie," she answered. "Sadie what?" "Sadie Monroe." He repeated her name in his head as he walked to his desk, his mind racing. There were laws against this. Protections. People were supposed to care. He sat behind the desk and watched her sitting there on the floor, holding her sponge like it was the only tool she had to keep herself afloat in the world. Security arrived minutes later, confused until they saw the child, and then silent as Michael gave them orders. The woman listed on the janitorial staff's after-hours logbook, Sadie's so-called aunt, was removed from the building before the hour was up. Michael didn't want to hear her excuses. He didn't care how desperate she was or how much she needed the job. He only cared that she had left a little girl to clean floors like a servant, hidden behind the hum of late-night office life. When they asked what to do with the child, he hesitated. "She's not going to a shelter tonight," he said firmly. "But sir," the head of security began, but Michael raised a hand. "She's coming with me." It was impulsive. Reckless, even. He was well aware of the legal complications, the paperwork, the risk to his spotless reputation. But he didn't care. He couldn't walk away from her. Not after what he'd seen. That night, Michael Langston, a man known for keeping everyone at a distance, took home a child he'd never met, simply because she had looked up at him with eyes too tired for 6 years old and told him she had no one. And somewhere deep inside him, something cracked open. Something he thought had long since turned to stone. The ride home was quiet. Sadie sat in the back seat of Michael's black town car, her legs swinging slightly above the floor, hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't seem afraid, only tired, her eyes drifting toward the window where raindrops blurred the city lights. Michael sat beside her, watching her from time to time, trying to make sense of what he was doing. He had always made decisions quickly in business, guided by instinct and calculation, but this wasn't a calculated move. This wasn't a decision at all. It felt more like an inevitability. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he brought her into the car. That she would cry? Ask questions? Maybe fall asleep and forget where she was? But she didn't. She remained still and composed, too composed for someone her age. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy, like they were both aware they had crossed an invisible line neither of them fully understood. When they arrived at his penthouse, the doorman gave him a curious look but said nothing. Michael led Sadie through the marble lobby and up the private elevator, the quiet hum of motion filling the space between them. Once inside, she followed him down the hall without hesitation, her small sneakers squeaking lightly against the hardwood. He stopped in front of the guest bedroom, the one he hadn't used in years, and opened the door. The room was clean but plain, white walls, a simple bed, a small dresser, and a reading lamp. "This will be your room for now," he said, unsure of what tone to use with a 6-year-old. "If you need anything, just knock. I'll be across the hall." She nodded once and walked inside, her eyes scanning the space with a kind of quiet efficiency. She didn't ask for toys or a story or a glass of water. She simply sat on the edge of the bed, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him. "Thank you," she said softly. He blinked, caught off guard by her calm. "You're welcome." She didn't say anything else, and neither did he. After a moment, he closed the door gently behind him and stood in the hallway, exhaling slowly. He didn't go to his room. Instead, he walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of scotch. The city sparkled outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, indifferent to the shift that had taken place inside his home. He leaned against the counter, sipping slowly, trying to reconcile the man he was supposed to be with the one who had just brought a stranger, a child, into his home. The next morning came earlier than expected. Michael, usually up by 6, was already dressed and working through emails when he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. Sadie appeared in the doorway of the living room, dressed in the same blue jumpsuit she'd worn the night before. Her hair was messy, but her face was clean. She looked small against the vastness of the room, but she stood with a quiet dignity that made her seem older than she was. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied. "Are you hungry?" She hesitated. "Yes." He guided her into the kitchen, awkwardly navigating the unfamiliar territory of caring for a child. He didn't cook. There were chefs who came 3 times a week to prepare his meals in advance, but this morning he made scrambled eggs himself, standing stiffly at the stove while she sat at the counter watching him. She ate slowly, neatly, not wasting a bite. He watched her more than he should have, fascinated by the way she moved, the way she didn't speak unless spoken to. Most children he'd seen, his employees' kids at company events, relatives he barely remembered, were noisy, unpredictable, often demanding. Sadie was none of those things. After breakfast, he called one of his lawyers, requesting immediate research into emergency guardianship laws and procedures. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew he wasn't sending her back to the woman who had forced her to scrub floors at night. Not after what he'd seen. Throughout the day, he worked from home, a rare change in his routine. Sadie stayed mostly in the guest room, reading from a small stack of children's books Lydia, the housekeeper, had brought by. Michael checked on her once, expecting to find her napping or playing. Instead, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading silently, her expression focused and peaceful. He leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a moment before she looked up. "Is it okay that I read in here?" "Of course," he said. "You can go wherever you like." She nodded, but didn't get up. That evening, as the city lights began to flicker on one by one outside the windows, Michael found himself thinking about his own childhood. The orphanage. The cold beds. The endless noise of other children, none of whom stayed. He had been Sadie's age when he realized no one was coming for him. That memory had hardened him, shaped him into a man who needed no one. But watching Sadie now, so quiet, so contained, he wondered what would have happened if someone had stepped in for him. If someone had looked at him and said, "I won't walk away." He wasn't ready to admit it aloud, but something inside him was shifting. Not quickly, and not entirely comfortably, but it was there. That night, before she went to sleep, she walked to his office door and knocked once. He looked up from his laptop. "I brushed my teeth," she said. "And I washed my hands. Do you want to check?" He smiled, almost despite himself. "No need. I trust you." She looked surprised. Then she nodded and turned back toward her room. "Good night, Sadie." "Good night, Michael." He sat in the quiet after she left, staring at the open document on his screen, the numbers and projections suddenly feeling meaningless. For the first time in years, the work didn't hold his full attention. There was a child asleep down the hall who didn't belong to him, not yet, but somehow already did. And he wasn't sure what that meant. But he knew he couldn't ignore it. Michael Langston wasn't used to someone else's presence in his home. His penthouse had always been a fortress of solitude, silent, controlled, sterile. For years, he had taken comfort in that silence, convincing himself it was peace. But now, with a child down the hall, the quiet felt different. Not oppressive, exactly, but watchful. As if the walls were waiting to see what he would do next. The following days passed in a haze of adjustment. Sadie continued to surprise him with her quiet routines, her lack of complaints, and her strange, almost unsettling maturity. She woke early, made her bed perfectly, and always waited for permission before touching anything that wasn't hers. She was polite, careful, and unerringly self-sufficient. Michael watched her, fascinated and troubled. It was obvious that this wasn't just a well-behaved child, this was a child who had learned not to be a burden. He couldn't stop thinking about that night in the office. The image of her, on her knees with rubber gloves and a sponge, haunted him. No child should ever know what it feels like to work to earn their right to sleep under a roof. It stayed with him in meetings, during phone calls, even as he reviewed contracts that once consumed his full attention. The sharper part of his mind told him this situation needed a resolution, a legal path, a clear plan. But the quieter part, the one he'd ignored for years, told him not to rush, not to hand her off to the system that had already failed her once. One evening, a few days after Sadie had arrived, he found her sitting alone in the living room. The television was on, but muted, playing some animated film. She wasn't watching it. Her knees were drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around them. He stood in the doorway for a moment before walking in and sitting on the armchair across from her. "Is something wrong?" he asked. She shook her head. "Are you sure?" She nodded, but after a pause, she said quietly, "Do you think they'll make me leave?" The question hit him harder than he expected. She didn't look at him when she asked. Her voice wasn't desperate. It was resigned, like she had already accepted the possibility and just needed to prepare for it. I don't want to leave, she added after a beat. It's quiet here. Nobody yells. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching her carefully. No one is making you leave right now, he said. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure no one does. She finally looked at him then, her eyes wide and searching, as if trying to decide whether she could believe him. Do you promise? The word sat between them like a challenge. He didn't make promises. Not in business, not in life. Promises were fragile, emotional. But something about the way she asked, so careful, so small, made it impossible to dodge. I promise I won't let anything happen to you, he said. She gave a small nod and looked away, her arms still wrapped tightly around her legs, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. Later that night, he found himself walking into one of the storage rooms at the back of his penthouse, a space he hadn't entered in years. It was filled with boxes from old moves, unopened crates, things from another life. As he dug through them, he found a dusty cardboard box marked, Michael, Personal. Inside were photographs, books, a faded sweater, and at the bottom, a file folder with his name typed in block letters, a case file from his time in the system. He sat down on the floor with it, his back against the wall, and flipped through the yellowed pages. Notes from social workers, behavioral reports, records of failed placements. He read phrases like, disconnected, difficult to bond, emotionally distant. He saw how many times his file had been passed from one office to another, how few people had stayed involved for more than a few months. He closed the folder and sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of a past he thought he'd outrun. He didn't want that for Sadie. He didn't want her to become another name in a folder, another forgotten child in the system. He didn't want her to learn, like he had, that being alone was safer than being disappointed. The next morning, he called his legal team. He told them to prepare the paperwork for emergency guardianship. They asked questions, of course, about liability, about media fallout, about his image, but he answered them all with the same flat certainty. She's staying here. Do what you have to do. That afternoon, he took Sadie to a children's store. She was hesitant at first, clinging to the doorframe like she didn't belong there. He had to gently coax her in, showing her rows of clothes, books, toys. She didn't run or ask for anything. She walked carefully down each aisle, touching things with only the tips of her fingers. He picked out items himself, clothes in soft colors, warm socks, pajamas with stars on them. He gave her a shopping basket and told her to choose whatever she wanted. She stood there for a long time, unmoving, before finally whispering, "Can I really?" "Yes," he said. "Anything you want." She chose a single book. A collection of fairy tales. That night, she sat on the couch beside him while he read to her from it. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder, and for the first time, he felt something shift in his chest, something warm, unfamiliar, and terrifying. He didn't know what kind of future he could give her. But he knew he would fight for it. Not because he felt responsible, and not because he was trying to make up for his own childhood. Because for the first time in his life, someone needed him, and he wanted to stay. Rain had been falling steadily all morning, a thin mist clinging to the windows as if the sky itself wasn't ready to release what it carried. Michael stood at the kitchen counter, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, watching the blurred skyline through the glass. The city looked distant, like a faded memory, unreachable and irrelevant. Behind him, soft footsteps padded across the floor. He didn't have to turn to know it was Sadie. She had a way of entering rooms without disruption, like she'd learned to exist in the quiet spaces people left behind. She climbed onto one of the bar stools and sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes scanning the countertop. She hadn't spoken yet that morning, but he could tell something was different. She was chewing her bottom lip and glancing at him the way a child might glance at a closed door they were afraid to open. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked, his voice gentle. She shook her head. I already ate a banana. Michael set the mug down and leaned forward slightly. Are you feeling okay? She hesitated, then shrugged. I had a dream last night. He didn't press her. He waited. I was back at my aunt's place, she continued softly. She said I had to clean the stairs before I could eat. I didn't have my gloves. My hands hurt. Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression calm. It was just a dream. You're safe now. I know. Her voice cracked a little. But it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like before. Michael walked around the counter and knelt beside her stool so they were eye level. I can't promise you'll never have bad dreams again, but I can promise that no one will ever make you do that again. Not while I'm here. Sadie looked down at him, her eyes shiny but dry. You mean it? I mean it. Something shifted between them in that moment, not dramatically, but deeply. It was as if the thread of trust, thin and fragile, had finally been tied at both ends. She gave him a small nod, and he gently reached for her hand. It was warm and so small in his, like it had never been held without reason. Later that day, they spent time in the guest room, sorting the new clothes and books they'd bought. Michael had cleared space in the closet, installed a small bookshelf, and ordered a soft rug with a pale lavender pattern Sadie had quietly admired in a catalog. She didn't squeal or jump or react the way most children might have. She simply looked around the room and whispered, "It's really mine?" "Yes," Michael said. "All of this is yours." She didn't say thank you right away. She sat on the rug and ran her fingers along its texture. Then, after a pause, she looked up at him and asked, "What was your room like when you were little?" The question caught him off guard. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, remembering. It was small. A shared room in the orphanage. We had bunk beds and lockers instead of dressers. My mattress had springs that poked through if I turned the wrong way. I didn't have anything that was mine. Not even shoes, really. Everything was passed down. "Did someone read to you?" she asked. "No," he said quietly. "No one really had time." Sadie stood and walked over to the bookshelf, selecting the fairy tale book she had picked out. She returned to the bed and placed it beside him. "Then maybe I can read to you," she offered. Michael smiled, surprised by how deeply those few words struck him. "I'd like that." She opened the book and began reading in a soft voice, her finger following each word. She stumbled sometimes, unsure of the longer ones, but she didn't ask for help. She wanted to do it on her own. He sat beside her, listening, watching the way her brow furrowed in concentration, how seriously she took the simple act of telling a story. He had read hundreds of contracts, thousands of documents, but he'd never listened so carefully to anything as he did to that 6-year-old girl reading from a book with worn corners and golden stars on the cover. When she finished the story, she leaned against him without a word, her head resting on his side. He didn't move for a long time. Didn't want to. He placed a hand gently on her back and let his eyes close for a few moments. For the first time since he was a boy, he felt like the silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of breath and warmth and meaning. That evening, Michael made a call to his lawyer and requested a meeting with a child therapist recommended by the firm. He wanted to be sure he was doing the right thing, not just legally, but emotionally. He didn't know how to raise a child, but he was ready to learn. More importantly, he was ready to listen. After he hung up, he found Sadie at the dining table drawing with colored pencils Lydia had left for her. Her picture was of a tall building with a little girl at the top window and a man standing on the sidewalk looking up. She had drawn them both smiling. "Is that us?" he asked. Sadie nodded. "It's the first night you saw me." He sat beside her and looked at the drawing. The lines were uneven, the colors imperfect, but it was the most honest thing he'd seen in years. "Thank you," he said. She looked confused. For what? For letting me be in your story. She smiled then, shy and small, but real. And in that moment, Michael Langston, who had once believed his life was complete in its isolation, knew without question that everything before her had been missing something he hadn't known he needed. Until now. The air in the penthouse had grown warmer, not in temperature but in spirit. The once sterile walls now echoed faintly with traces of life, footsteps that didn't belong only to Michael, laughter so quiet it felt like a miracle, and the occasional hum of a child lost in thought. Sadie had begun to feel at home, and although she never said it out loud, Michael could see it in the way she moved. She no longer hesitated before entering a room. She left her drawings on the coffee table instead of tucking them away. She slept without checking the door 3 times. He noticed it all, even the smallest changes. Her presence had woven itself into his days so completely that he found himself rearranging meetings, canceling late-night calls, and reading articles about parenting he would have once scrolled past without thought. But peace, especially the kind that arrives unexpectedly, never lasts without being tested. It began with a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon. Michael was in his home office, going over design revisions for a new property development when his assistant patched through an unexpected call from a woman with the Department of Family Services. Her voice was crisp and impersonal, laced with the kind of authority that made his chest tighten. She informed him, politely but firmly, that a formal report had been submitted regarding a minor, Sadie Monroe, currently in his custody without an official placement or approved guardianship. A follow-up visit had already been scheduled for the next day. He sat in silence for a moment, his pen motionless in his hand, and then he thanked her, ended the call, and stared out the window. The city skyline stretched before him, indifferent and eternal. He had known this moment would come. Nothing in his life ever went unchallenged for long. He called his legal team immediately, demanding everything be expedited: documents, court motions, interviews, evaluations. He wanted every signature, every necessary piece of paper filed within the hour. That evening, he didn't tell Sadie what had happened. He didn't want to worry her, not until he had answers, not until he could promise her something solid. But she must have felt the shift in his energy because she kept looking at him during dinner, her fork hovering above her plate. "You're quiet," she said finally. Michael forced a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." She nodded like she understood, and in some ways, she probably did more than most adults would have. But after she brushed her teeth and changed into pajamas, she came to his office door and lingered in the frame. "Are you still going to be here tomorrow?" The question nearly broke him. He looked up from his screen and met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "I'll be here." She nodded and turned to leave, but before she walked away, she added, "I'll be here too." The next morning arrived with gray skies and cold wind. The caseworker's knock came precisely at 9. Michael opened the door to a woman in her 40s with neat hair and a clipboard clutched tightly under her arm. She introduced herself as Ms. Davison and didn't smile. She asked to see the child immediately. Michael called Sadie, who came quietly, holding her stuffed fox in one hand. She greeted Ms. Davison politely and sat where instructed. The interview was brief but piercing. The woman asked Sadie where she had been staying before, whether she had ever been hurt, whether she felt safe now. Sadie answered everything with quiet honesty. Her voice only trembled once, when she was asked what she would do if she had to leave again. "I don't know," she said, eyes lowered. "I'd try to be small again. So no one gets mad." Michael stood very still at that. The sentence hit like ice water down his back. Ms. Davison took notes, thanked them both, and left as efficiently as she'd arrived. Michael watched the elevator doors close and then walked back inside, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. He called his lawyer within minutes. He didn't want updates. He wanted outcomes. He wanted signatures. He wanted his name on her forms. Later that day, Michael sat Sadie down in the living room and explained, as gently as he could, what was happening. She listened without fidgeting, her fox clutched tightly in her arms. "Will they take me?" she asked. "I won't let them," he said. "Even if they try?" "Yes," he answered. "Even then." That night, after she had gone to bed, he poured himself a drink and stood by the window, watching the storm clouds gather above the city. For the first time in years, fear crept into his chest, not fear of loss or failure, but fear of being too late. The system didn't care about love. It cared about forms, credentials, boxes checked and guidelines met. He had always worked within systems, dominated them even, but this was different. This was personal. The next morning brought news from his attorney. The emergency guardianship hearing was scheduled for the following week. It was fast, but not fast enough to ease his anxiety. Until then, Sadie's fate hung in a space too uncertain for either of them to fully rest. He didn't tell her the date. He didn't want her counting down the hours with dread. Instead, he tried to keep everything the same, reading to her in the evenings, helping her with small art projects, listening when she told stories about school or dreams. But it was there, under the surface, always. The ticking clock neither of them could ignore. One evening, as she colored at the kitchen table, she asked without looking up, "If they don't let me stay, will you still think about me?" Michael looked at her for a long time, then walked over and knelt beside her chair. "Sadie," he said quietly, "there isn't a version of my life where I forget you." She nodded, but her lip trembled. He pulled her close, held her tight, and said nothing more. He couldn't promise the system would see what he saw. But he could promise her this: he would fight. Not with words, not with wealth, but with everything he had. Because she wasn't a guest anymore. She wasn't a temporary act of charity. She was his. And no piece of paper could change that. The days leading up to the hearing moved slowly, filled with an anxious stillness that wrapped itself around every corner of Michael's penthouse. There was no more pretending, no more gentle distractions or quiet avoidance. Sadie knew the truth now. Michael had tried to shield her from the weight of it, but she was too observant, too experienced in uncertainty, to be fooled. She never asked outright about the hearing, but he could see it in the way she watched him, in how she followed him with her eyes as he paced during phone calls, in how she became quieter during meals. She was bracing for something, even though she didn't know what the courtroom would be like or what exactly was at stake. She just knew it could change everything. Michael, for his part, had never felt more powerless. He had spent his entire life building control over his company, his image, his world. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal or a negotiation. It wasn't something he could outmaneuver with a contract or overwhelm with charm. The court wouldn't care that he was a billionaire or that he had turned his company into one of the most respected firms in the country. They would care about protocol, about precedent, about background checks and stability, and whether a single man with no parenting experience could possibly be trusted with a child like Sadie. And none of his accomplishments could answer that question the way he wanted them to. He spent hours reviewing documents with his attorney, practicing responses to possible questions, preparing for every angle of the hearing. He hated it, not because he disliked preparation, but because it felt like he was trying to prove something that should have already been obvious. He loved her. That should have been enough. But in the eyes of the system, love was never enough. It had to be weighed, measured, verified. It had to be proven with affidavits, and affidavits could never capture the way Sadie had changed his life. One evening, just 3 days before the court date, Michael came home earlier than usual. He found Sadie sitting on the windowsill in the living room, her knees tucked to her chest, staring out at the skyline. She didn't turn when he entered. He walked over and stood beside her, looking out at the same horizon. The sun was setting, streaking the sky in gold and pale lavender, the kind of light that made even the coldest buildings look soft. "It's pretty," she said. He nodded. It is. She turned to look at him. Do you think they'll let me stay? Michael didn't lie to her. He never had, and he wasn't about to start. I don't know, he said. But I'll be there. Every second. And I'll tell them everything that matters. She looked back out the window, quiet for a long time. What if they say no? He turned then, kneeling so he could meet her eyes. Then we find another way, he said. We keep fighting. But I need you to know something, no matter what happens. She blinked, her eyes searching his. You've already changed everything for me. And nothing they say can take that away. She nodded slowly, but her lip trembled, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Michael reached up and gently wiped it away with his thumb, then pulled her into his arms. She held on tightly, her small hands clinging to the back of his shirt like she was afraid he might vanish if she let go. The night before the hearing, Michael couldn't sleep. He sat in his office, the city a glittering blur beyond the windows, and stared at a folder on his desk. Inside were photographs, letters of recommendation, psychological evaluations, and a personal statement he had rewritten over a dozen times. None of it felt like enough. It was all too sterile, too detached. None of it said what he truly wanted to say, that Sadie wasn't just a child he had rescued. She was the one who had reached into the quiet ruins of his life and made him feel human again. Eventually, just after midnight, he opened a blank page and began to write, not for the judge or the attorney, but for her. He wrote about the night he found her in his office, how small and steady she had looked scrubbing the floor, how her voice had broken something inside him that he hadn't known was still breakable. He wrote about her questions, her quiet bravery, the way she never asked for more than what she needed but gave more than anyone expected. He wrote about how he had changed, not instantly, not easily, but permanently. And at the end, he wrote one simple sentence: I didn't save her, she saved me. The next morning came cold and gray. The drive to the courthouse was silent. Sadie sat beside him in the back seat, dressed in a dark green dress and a small wool coat that Lydia had chosen for her. She held his hand the entire way, her grip small but firm. Michael wore a tailored black suit, his tie perfectly knotted, every detail precise. He looked like a man ready for a press conference, but his heart beat like it was his first day in court. The hearing room was smaller than he expected. No cameras, no audience. Just the judge, the caseworker, a guardian ad litem, Michael's attorney, and Sadie. She sat beside him at the table, her feet not reaching the floor, her hands folded carefully in her lap. The judge asked the questions they'd prepared for. Background, income, stability, plans for schooling and childcare. Michael answered them all with calm precision. Then the judge turned to Sadie and asked the most important question of the day. Sadie, can you tell me, in your own words, where you'd like to live? There was a pause so long it made the room hold its breath. Sadie looked down at her hands, then up at the judge, and finally at Michael. I want to stay with him, she said. Because when I was alone, I didn't feel real. But when he talks to me, I feel like I exist. Like I matter. And I never want to go back to not mattering. Michael's chest tightened. His eyes burned, but he didn't look away. He held her hand tighter, and this time, she squeezed back. The judge looked down, made a note, and said nothing more for a long while. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. This court grants temporary guardianship to Mr. Michael Langston, pending further evaluation and review. The child will remain in his care. Michael exhaled. It wasn't everything, not yet, but it was enough for now. Sadie looked up at him, and in that moment, neither of them needed words. They had crossed something vast together, something most people never even see. And they had done it side by side. The weeks following the court's decision passed with a calm that felt almost fragile, as if any sudden movement might shake it apart. Michael found himself more protective than ever, not because the law required it, but because the experience had stripped away the final layer of distance he had allowed to remain between himself and Sadie. She was no longer a guest in his home. She was no longer a child he had temporarily rescued from a dark place. She was family now, whether the paperwork said it or not. And she began to feel it too, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the quiet comfort with which she began to live. She laughed more. She drew pictures of the two of them and taped them to the fridge without asking. She called his name when she had a bad dream, and not once did she check the door 3 times before bed. Her trust, which had once been held so tightly behind those large, brown eyes, was now something she gave him freely, piece by piece, without even knowing she was doing it. Michael had expected to feel overwhelmed by the responsibility. He had expected to feel like he was losing control of his life. But what surprised him most was how much he liked the version of himself that existed when he was with her. He no longer cared if he missed a dinner with investors or rescheduled a board meeting. He woke up earlier to make breakfast with her. He started leaving work earlier to be home in time to help her with her reading. He didn't miss the man he used to be, because for the first time in his adult life, he didn't feel hollow at the center. Every day with her filled something he hadn't known was empty. But life had a way of reminding him that peace was always temporary. One Monday morning, Michael was sitting in his office at the company's headquarters, reviewing final plans for a luxury development that had been delayed twice already. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting for a response, something she never did unless it was urgent. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "A woman. She says she's Sadie's biological mother." Michael stood slowly, the words not quite making sense. He had been told Sadie's parents were out of the picture. He had seen no records of a living parent with any claim. The aunt had abandoned her, and the court had cleared the way for guardianship. He followed his assistant down the hallway without speaking, heart thudding, thoughts racing. In the conference room sat a woman in her early 30s, with long, dark hair and weary eyes. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she looked up when he entered, her expression both nervous and determined. "My name is Emily Monroe," she said quietly. "Sadie is my daughter." Michael didn't respond immediately. He took the seat across from her, studying her face, searching for some trace of familiarity. And he saw it, around the eyes, the shape of the mouth. Sadie's features, mirrored faintly in this stranger. "I was told you were dead," he said, not accusing, just confused. "I might as well have been," she replied. "I was addicted. I lost everything. When they took her from me, I wasn't fit to fight it. I didn't even try. But I've been clean for over a year now. I finished a recovery program. I have a job. I have a place to live. And I want to see her." Michael's stomach turned. Part of him wanted to rage, to throw her out, to protect Sadie from any further disruption. But the other part, the part that had once been a child waiting for someone to come back for him, understood what it took to sit across from a stranger and ask for forgiveness. "She doesn't know you're alive," he said. "I know. That's why I'm not asking to take her. I just want to see her. Talk to her. Maybe explain." Michael didn't answer right away. He needed time, but he also knew there was no version of this that ended with hiding the truth. That night, he sat with Sadie in the living room and explained gently, carefully, what had happened. He told her that her mother hadn't stopped loving her, only that she had been sick and lost for a long time. He told her her mother was alive. And that she wanted to see her. Sadie didn't cry. She didn't ask why it had taken so long. She only asked, "Does she want me to live with her now?" "No," Michael said quickly. "She just wants to talk. Only if you want to." Sadie was quiet for a long time. Then she whispered, "Can you come with me?" Michael nodded. "Of course." The meeting was held in a private room at a neutral site, with a counselor present. Emily entered nervously, holding her purse like a shield. Sadie sat beside Michael, smaller than usual, her face calm but unreadable. Emily knelt to be at her level and didn't reach for her, didn't push. She only said, "You're so much taller than I remember." Sadie didn't respond, but she didn't turn away either. Emily spoke for a while, about her mistakes, her regrets, the choices she had made. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, just a chance to say what she should have said long ago. Sadie listened without interrupting. When Emily finished, there was silence. Then Sadie said softly, "I don't remember your voice." Emily's face crumpled, but she didn't cry. She nodded and replied, "That's okay. Maybe one day, you will." On the way home, Sadie leaned against Michael in the back seat. She didn't say much, but just before they pulled into the garage, she looked up at him and asked, "Will you still be my dad, even if I talk to her sometimes?" Michael's heart broke and healed all at once. "Always," he said. "That will never change." Sadie nodded and leaned her head against his arm again, as if that settled it. And it did. She had faced something most children never had to, and she had done it with a quiet strength that humbled him. She had chosen not between two parents, but for herself, for honesty, for openness, for love that didn't have to be divided to be real. And in doing so, she had shown Michael something he hadn't yet dared to believe: she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming whole. Spring arrived slowly, as if the city itself had needed time to thaw. The trees in the park near Michael's building began to bloom in soft whites and pale pinks, and the air lost its sharp edge, warming just enough to bring people outside again. Children played on sidewalks, couples held hands beneath budding branches, and everything began to feel like it was starting over. In many ways, Michael felt that he was, too. But this time, it wasn't alone. Life with Sadie had become something steady, something unspoken and sacred. There were still moments of uncertainty, questions that crept in during long nights, worries he couldn't completely silence, but there was peace in the way she called for him in the mornings, in the drawings she taped to his office wall, in the soft way she fell asleep in the back seat during late car rides home. She had become a part of his world, not with disruption but with quiet certainty, and he had learned to rearrange himself around her without resistance. The final court hearing for full legal guardianship came in late April. Unlike the first, this one felt less like a trial and more like a confirmation of what had already been decided by time and love. The paperwork had been reviewed, the home visits completed, the psychological evaluation submitted. But none of it mattered to Michael as much as what was happening in his own living room each day. When they stood before the judge, Sadie held his hand tightly, wearing a light blue dress she had chosen herself and a silver bracelet Michael had given her the day before. It had her initials engraved on the inside. She had cried when she opened it, not from sadness or joy, but from the quiet overwhelm of being seen, remembered, chosen. The judge, a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and a voice like warm stone, looked over the last page of the report and smiled gently before delivering her decision. Michael Langston was granted permanent, legal guardianship of Sadie Monroe, with the full rights and responsibilities that came with being her parent. The words didn't echo, didn't ring out with dramatic flair, they simply landed, as quietly as a sunrise, shifting the shape of the world without needing applause. Afterward, they walked out into the light together, and Michael lifted Sadie into his arms. She buried her face in his neck and whispered, "Is it okay that I still feel like it's not real?" He hugged her tighter. "It feels real to me. Every second." She nodded, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Michael began putting plans in motion for something he had thought about since the day he saw her washing the floors of his office. He purchased a quiet building in Brooklyn, a rundown former school, and began the process of converting it into a community center for children in crisis. It would be a place for kids like Sadie, children who had been overlooked, passed between homes, told in too many ways that they were too much or not enough. The center would offer shelter, food, art therapy, education, and, most importantly, people who listened. He named it the Monroe House, not just in honor of Sadie, but in recognition of everything her name now meant to him. Sadie visited the site with him regularly. She walked through the half-finished halls with wonder in her eyes, watching as walls were painted, bookshelves installed, and art supplies unpacked. She chose the colors for the reading room and picked out the first books to line the shelves. She asked thoughtful questions during meetings and introduced herself to workers with a small but confident voice. One day, standing in the main room where the welcome desk would be, she turned to Michael and said, "You used to build buildings. Now you're building something else." He smiled. "I'm building a place where someone like you never has to feel invisible again." She stepped closer and took his hand. "That's the best thing you've ever built." When the Monroe House officially opened, there was no press, no media, no ceremony beyond a small gathering of children, volunteers, and a few of Michael's closest colleagues. Sadie gave the first tour herself, guiding a group of children through the halls with quiet pride. She showed them where they could paint, where they could read, where they could sit if they just needed to be alone. She explained the importance of the kindness cupboard, a small room filled with essentials, free to anyone who needed them. And at the end of the tour, she said something that Michael would never forget. "I know what it feels like to be nobody," she told the group. "But this place is for people who need to be reminded they're somebody." Later that night, when the last guest had gone and the lights in the building had dimmed, Michael and Sadie sat together on the front steps, eating ice cream from paper cups and watching the stars slowly appear above the city. Sadie leaned her head on his shoulder, and after a long moment of silence, she said, "I think we made something good." Michael didn't speak right away. He looked down at her, at the way her hair curled at the ends, at the bracelet glinting softly on her wrist, at the child who had once been so quiet she barely spoke above a whisper and now filled rooms with meaning just by being in them. "We made each other," he finally said. She smiled and closed her eyes, the night wrapping gently around them. And for the first time in either of their lives, forever didn't feel like a word meant for other people. It felt like home. This story, at its heart, is not just about rescue, it's about recognition. It's about two people who were invisible in different ways: one, a child too small to be heard; the other, a man too guarded to be seen. What makes the ending powerful is not that it's happy in a traditional sense, but that it feels earned. The journey they take, slow, raw, often quiet, is full of the kind of choices that transform people, not in grand, cinematic moments, but in the soft, persistent ones, showing up, listening, staying. The final image, of them on the steps of the center they built together, lingers because it's not triumphant, it's real. It says, healing is possible, family can be chosen, and even the most closed heart can open when someone brave enough walks through its silence. And maybe that's the most hopeful truth of all.